Strategy is the intent, but tactics is putting intent to action. This episode unpacks why you've got to have both tactics and strategy to be an effective disciple maker and leader. Coming up. Okay, Dave, so we just spent really 6 episodes diving into the topic of what does it mean to be a strategy coordinator, and then the 5 T's of coordinating strategy. We got an awesome, high-quality crew of leaders together to get to unpack from practitioners who've got experience doing this stuff. How do you coordinate strategy to engage and to actually see traction in a specific focused target? And it's super helpful. And as I've started talking with some guys who are really processing this here, it really brought to my mind just the importance of rounding out that conversation with, at least on our podcast. I think it's happening in lots of other places, but on our podcast, the topic of tactics as well. And so we're used as sort of a business word, military word, strategy. I mean, it transcends lots of different applications, but strategy. But in a military sense, that goes along with tactics. And so I'm going to frame this up with a couple of statements, and then you share your thoughts. But I had a mentor say this: you can win a war with tactics and no strategy, but you can't win a war with strategy and no tactics. And then a secondary statement of strategy is the intent, but tactics is putting intent to action. So
yeah, both of them good phrases.
We've got to have strategy, and so even in the first phrase, it's like we're not trying to pit them against each other, because they're both absolutely necessary, but just trying to identify the function of each and the importance of each. What are your thoughts on where strategy intersects tactics and where that fits into a follow-up conversation to the 5 T's?
Mark, it's just funny. It just seems like you and I just keep looping back around to this conversation over and over and over again. And we use different words and different descriptions and illustrations to get back to it. Because we've even talked about, we got to be somebody who not only knows how to train, but knows how to do. We've talked about how when someone is a trainer, you can tell whether or not they've actually practiced this by the way in which they train it. We have talked about how the great equalizer is the field, that it is humiliating in a lot of ways, because whether you're a 10-year experienced veteran or you're a 1 month just trained, beginner, when you go out and you start sharing the gospel, you're on the same playing field, because we're at the mercy of the Holy Spirit's work in what we're doing. It's not to say that experience doesn't help. I think it does. But at the end of the day, we're still plugging at this idea of what is the role of the tactics and what is the role of the strategy. I'll say it this way. Our church has been in the book of Ephesians for the last 5-6 weeks. And something that really stuck out to me in the book of Ephesians this past time was that the prophets and the apostles are the ones that lay the foundation. And it's for the equipping, right, of the church to lay a basic foundational DNA for the church to begin to grow and to build. But the church together has the 5-fold gifts: apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, and teachers, for the equipping of the saints for the work that they're to do. And when you really look at the book of Ephesians, we have this master strategist named Jesus, and he ascends and he sends gifts so that his body together can accomplish the task and the purpose that we're meant to do. So you and I have talked about this. Jesus is the master strategist, and our job is really just to respond to his strategy. So I'll kick it back to you, and let's talk about why do we have to have tactics, and why do we have to have strategy, and what happens if we don't have one or the other?
Yeah. So thank you for even just framing that up. I think we have been circling back to this conversation, and we need to keep circling back to this conversation. If part of our vision and our goal is to see strategy coordinators mobilized, envisioned, equipped, because both are necessary to be an effective general to an army, to continue on with the metaphor. You can't see the big picture without having at least some experience with the tactics that the troops on the ground are using, the actions that they're doing to get to the big picture, because it's hard to be an effective strategist without having some experience around that. So we are not pursuing movement per se. We're pursuing Jesus, who modeled movement. And so in pursuing his model, that looks like following him today in the way that he's leading us into seeing disciples multiply. And if that's true, then all of our strategies are going to involve multiplication, because that's how Jesus accomplished the big vision during his time on the earth, when he was walking it out, and what he modeled for us. So that means that our strategies have got to include multiplication to follow in that same way of Jesus, I would say. I mean, I think there's people who would have a different understanding of all that, but just the path that we've walked down, Dave, is just saying, this is what we see Jesus doing, and open to correction, but at this point, that's what I see Jesus doing. And so if that's true, then the tactics means I've got to have experience and understanding of not only how to make disciples, that's pretty critical, pretty clear in the Great Commission, but then how to help those disciples multiply. And so we have this well-known quoted verse, the 2-2-2 principle, Paul in 2 Timothy, the things you've heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, and trust to reliable people who will be also qualified to teach others. So it's important that when we are pursuing these tactics of multiplication, we're able to train not only how to make disciples, but to train a disciple. So Paul's training Timothy to train others, to find the qualified people to train others. And so anyway, all that to say, I think when I think of tactics versus strategy and that's a language we're adding on to try to understand what Jesus and Paul and the apostles did, but it's got to involve multiplication, because that's what we see Jesus doing in terms of his strategy. And then it's got to involve the tactics of how to make disciples and how to train those disciples to make disciples in a simple, reproducing way.
Well, and I'll go back to tag on to what you're saying in Ephesians 4, the very end of it, after the 5 gifts kind of section, the very end, he wraps it up. He says, but speaking the truth in love, let us grow in every way into him who is the head, which is Christ. So the whole goal of the gift sets to equip the church is that we can grow to the fullness of the measure of Christ, and that we're growing up into him who is the head. And he says, from him, the whole body. And I think one of the pieces you and I talk about a lot is this is about the multiplying church and our leaders, that we're looking at seeing the church multiplied. And Amen. Of course, the leaders are a part of that, but really it's the whole church together. And the leader's job is to help the church multiply. And leaders are what's necessary to help kind of spur that. But from him, the whole body, meaning the church, fitted and knit together by every supporting ligament. So what is that, every supporting ligament? Well, that means each individual person, each individual part of the church is fitting together and supporting one another, promotes the growth of the body for the building up of itself in love by the proper working of each individual part. And, in the book of Ephesians, we talked about this with our church. There's never a place in the book of Ephesians where Paul says singular, except for when he's talking about himself or when he's referencing the way in which we're equipped. And he's saying the whole point of our equipping, the whole point of our disciple making, the whole point of our walk and abiding with Christ is that we can be that supporting ligament. We can do the work of our individual part for the sake of the body, which is the whole church, who has the head of Christ. So when it comes to the vision, I think, and what you're saying, and when it comes to the tactics, you and I kicked around this idea. Also, if we don't have a vision, we don't know really how to decide whether the tactics are helpful or not. Right?
Yeah, that's right.
Because we say, you could win a war with tactics, but the likelihood of you winning a war with just tactics is going to be really small if if there's a whole bunch of people who are separately trying to do tactics apart from each other. Because how do we communicate with each other? How do we know where we're going, what we're doing? Well, the Bible is setting out that vision. So the beauty is we don't have to set out that vision. People from every tribe, tongue, and nation under the lordship of Jesus Christ is the vision.
Yeah.
Right. So then if that vision is so big that neither you nor I can handle it, I'm overwhelmed by trying to see Oklahoma City. You're in a city so much more gargantuan than Oklahoma City, and you're overwhelmed by how do we do that? And we both understand there's no way I myself can do that. But the irony is there is one individual who can navigate that strategy.
Yeah.
And he's been working at it for 2,000 years, right? And what he's calling us to do is, as individuals, for us to understand our tactics so that we know how to respond to his leadership. So maybe we'll discuss it this way. If we know what the vision is, then we have to make preparations so that when the Spirit opens up, creates the opportunity for us to have gospel witness, we know the tactics to respond. And the people around us know the tactics to respond. Because if the opportunity presents itself and I don't know what to do in that opportunity, I miss that. Yeah.
I'm going to risk bringing in the example of what's happening in Ukraine right now. And maybe this is a misstep and will blow up in my face. But it seems like what I see happening there, I mean, of course, what information is actually accurate coming out of that war theater at this point? Everybody's trying to posture and tell their narrative. So the narrative that I understand anyway seems to be that Putin and Russia is struggling to accomplish the vision that they had, the strategy that they had. And at least some of that seems to be that the opportunity came for their perspective. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but for their goal, for their vision, the opportunity came to enforce their vision for the world and to stand up and to invade Ukraine, all those things. And it seems like their tactics were not real ready. That their supply lines are pretty sad and pathetic from what I've been understanding. They're like tanks are getting stuck in the mud. They're losing massive numbers of troops that they shouldn't have if their army was really as ready and prepared and robust as they claimed it was. And so it seems like an example of they had the strategy of, and it seems like they've been executing that strategy of around Kyiv and other cities, but the tactics are a little bit lacking. So the opportunities come, but were they ready for it?
Well, and I will say this, the more elite a leader is or perceives themselves or the people perceives them to be, the more they're actually going to follow their leadership whenever things get difficult. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is that the further removed away a leader is from the actual happenings on the ground, no matter what the scenario is, then people lose their trust in that leader because they feel like they're not understood, or if the leader can't possibly really understand what they're going through. And so, whether or not this podcast ages with time well or not, history will tell. But if we're going to bring up Zelinsky, one of the things I am super impressed with from my perspective and what I've read and understood about his leadership is, this dude has muddy boots. Like, the guy is on the ground, like flak jacket wearing with his people. And at the same time, he's turning around and doing diplomacy with world leaders on Zoom while he's wearing these army green t-shirts. Now, I get that the guy was a entertainer in his background. And so he understands probably better than some others about what perception really is and looks like. But he is projecting that he is a muddy boot general.
But even that's a tactic that he's employing there, which just shows a more effective way of mobilizing. I mean, he doesn't have the trained soldiers and the force. I mean, at least he did, and I think he's
got followers, and he has the backing of his people.
He does, and he's been empowering them. Not just with words, or again, just from what we understand and what we can see at this point. Like you said, things may change with time and how we understand all this story. But for what we can see at this point, he is sitting in the chair in his office and saying, "I'm not going anywhere." He's He's zooming from the streets where the battle is happening. All of those things are just showing like, I'm in this fight with you. Come alongside me. I mean, those kind of tactics engaged with a force that is technically not as well equipped and prepared as the Russians is currently not, I mean, I don't know if winning the day, but definitely they've been holding their own. Right.
And I will say that when you hear even some of the Ukrainian troops that are being interviewed or being talked to, and they're in a no-win situation. I don't like the situation, but when you see these guys in this no-win situation and they're saying, are you guys going to retreat? And their answer is, well, no, this is our country. This is our home. Like, we're not going to give this up. We will die before we give up our home. That is vision. And that is a step above strategy, because we talked in the last podcast, actually, that we did, the difference between being married to a problem versus married to a solution. And those guys are married to a problem. And the problem is someone is trying to take away their home, and their vision is no way. Right. And so they're going to do whatever it takes to accomplish what they believe in. And I'm just saying that when leaders are immersed in tactics and are doing the tactics alongside of the people that they're trying to lead, they're equipping them in not only the methods of getting the job done, but they're equipping them in why we get the job done, and they're inspiring them with why it matters to get the job done.
That's right.
Right. And so we're casting vision by getting our hands dirty. We're modeling methods by doing it with other people. And we're helping to coach in problem solving by helping them know that our strategy is accomplishing the vision. And so we may have to adjust that, but we're giving them direction to know how to take those tactics and make them work, or those methods or those tools. Yeah. So using our movement language, we're saying if a guy's not using the tools and demonstrating with modeling those tools to people, then he's not going to be able to explain to them the strategy very well, because they won't know how the tools line up. And he's really going to have a hard time casting vision in a way that captivates people's hearts and minds biblically to sacrifice whenever it seems like things aren't going the way that they should.
Man, that's good. Yeah, that's good, Dave. With the last part of this episode, I would love to just shift to talking about a tool that you and I both use that within No Place Left has been a way for us to just really clarify what do we mean in those tactics, and that's 139. And so we've used this. I mean, I don't even know if you'd call it a tool. It's a way of just defining what do we mean by if Jesus's model was multiplication, multiplying disciples as his strategy, and our tactics have got to be effective towards that. How do we then train up leaders and disciples? And so 139 is a way of saying, really, we'll just go back to the 2 Timothy 2:2. Paul, in this case, is the coach or the mentor, and he's saying to the one, Timothy, go find a faithful few and pour into them. So, Timothy, you've got to identify what are those faithful few. What do those faithful few look like? And at this point, Paul's at multiplication. He's seeing Timothy, who was addition to Paul. He's saying, Timothy, I want to help you find a few. But for Timothy, that's addition. He's still at a place where he's adding on a few. But then he says, and then help them to be qualified to teach others. And now we're hitting for Timothy multiplication. So I love just looking at that verse and thinking through. Sometimes in the movement world, we talk about fourth generational multiplication, and we can even kind of sometimes be overly focused or idolize that. But to me, the reason to talk about that is this verse, that Paul, as the coach or the mentor, wants to take these tactics of multiplying disciples that he's been employing and faithfully stewarding from Jesus, and help Timothy get to multiplication. And so for him, the faithful others that Timothy might find is not enough, because that's Paul seeing things multiply through Timothy, but he wants to help Timothy get even beyond that step to multiplication. So it's about helping Timothy shift his mindset into who do you invest deeply into, a few people, and then how do you help them identify a few others. And so for us, this tool of 139, or this idea of 139, pouring deeply into the right few, has been a way to encapsulate the vision of the tactics, but also use it to train up disciples and leaders to grow in the tactics of what it takes to multiply disciples so that the strategy can be accomplished.
Yeah, and I don't mean to take off too much of a detour, but a couple of context things is, one, we have to remember 1 Timothy was written, depending on how you date the book, which we're not going to go into that discussion. I'm an earlier date guy than a later date guy, but he is talking to Timothy, who has been with him for years.
Yeah.
At that point when he's writing it, and that's an apostolic book. It is not a pastoral book. It is, and if you disagree with me, there's some scholars out there. Go read Dr. Kostenberger. He agrees. But it's an apostolic-minded book where he's teaching Timothy how to establish elders, not teaching Timothy how to be an elder. Right? He's teaching Timothy what he should do to help the Ephesian church, which had already been planted. Paul had turned around and left to move forward towards maturity. With all that being said, put that into context. He's giving those multiplication steps to Timothy after spending years and years and years and years with him. So we're not necessarily always talking about a month or a year later. And if we put that in the context of the book of Ephesians, he's helping that ligament hold up his end of the equipping of the church.
Right.
So he's teaching Timothy how to equip the saints, which when multiplication comes down to it is we go using the Ephesians language and the Timothy language. When we're equipped in order to help other people learn how to do it, and then we turn around and we teach them how to equip others, that equipping role is when multiplication starts to take off.
Right.
Can you teach someone else to do what you do? And you cannot do that unless you yourself know how to do it.
Yeah.
Now,
I feel like
you might be able to cast vision, you might be able to give ideas, you might be able to give tools, but people know the difference between those who are talking about something they heard about and those who are talking about something they know how to do.
And I feel like the other part of that conversation, Dave, is can I teach somebody how to do what I do, but best practices begin to enter the conversation if I can then not only teach them how to do what I do, but how to teach them how to teach somebody else what I do. That really is the shift from addition thinking to multiplication thinking, because I can teach them how to do what I do, and they might be able to put it into practice, and they might even be able to bring a couple along. But then the question is that going to actually pass down farther than just them? And so one of the things I love about the 139 tool is it causes me as a disciple maker to understand how multiplication works. And so I may think that I've found that faithful, available, teachable, reproducing person, the FATTER acronym that we sometimes use, and they may or may not be that person, and that doesn't mean that I am kicking them to the curb, but it means I'm trying to find those that I can pour deeply into, so I can be a good steward, as Paul is telling Timothy. And it's the process, I guess, is the point I'm trying to get to. It's the process of trying to find that person that shapes my thinking from addition to multiplication. It causes me to get desperate for best practices of what will actually work, and then as I begin to use that same question and tool with that disciple, who are your 139, they're going to go through that same struggle and desperation of what's going to actually work, and it's going to help them to shift to multiplication thinking so that those tactics get established in those disciples.
And I would say that when, like we said, the field is the great equalizer. So whenever you have someone you're pouring into, if they're not pouring into another person, they tend to like to get complicated rather than simple, because whenever you're trying to get someone else moving forward, you realize how important it is to just put simple things in front of them to get their momentum going.
That's right.
If you're not pouring into someone and actually multiplying into another person, the complicated is really fun because you don't actually have to do anything with it. It's all just theory. But whenever it's in the life of another person, it's not just theory anymore. One other thing I would say is, I think sometimes at least in our network, the 139 gets kicked around. Is it leadership? Is it disciple making? And then everybody gets worried about pigeonholing that concept into, where it fits in the tool set. And the answer is, it's a way of describing a principle. And the principle is multiply yourself. So I was just sitting with a group in Oklahoma, and they got in the discussion when we talked about 139. They're like, well, how, do I do it for leaders? When do I get my 139? How do I get my 139? And what I just basically said is that whatever season you're in, multiply that into other people. If your season right now is that I'm sharing the gospel and I'm making disciples, then whenever you get some people you pour deeply into, help them learn how to share the gospel and make disciples. Once they start doing that and they start getting some others, and maybe you're more leadership development oriented, okay, then pour into 3 people and help them learn to be leaders on the next level. Okay, let's say you're trying to think about strategy on a larger level and other people need to learn that. Well, then get your 3 and teach them how to do the strategy on a little bit larger level. So I would just simply say it's not really a matter of when do we use the 139. The answer is always. You always have, try to get 3, 4, 2, whatever, but always have people that are with you in your life that you're taking the things that you're learning and have learned, and you're pouring them into somebody else so that they can grow just like you've grown. That's the principle that we're after.
Yeah. So we become like Zelinsky. We're shoulder to shoulder and not just having a bunch of good ideas, but no muddy boots. So
yeah,
love that.
Yeah.